All right. My name is Thomas Bespel. I'm the resident writing consultant here at the CBS Library. Thank you for coming tonight. This is the Craft of Research series, and tonight's talk, or this afternoon's talk, is about how to structure a research paper. So how to establish, how to organize the entire text, how to think about how the different parts go together. And as you know, I am a fan of metaphors of various kinds, of images that help us to understand things. And I worked out one for this one. It's the first time I'm going to try this, so see if you like this metaphor. Here we have a ordinary piece of paper, right? And as you can see, if I try to make this paper stand up, like you want your research to stand up for purposes of examination, there's really no, it doesn't really work, right? It just kind of falls right over. And I suppose I have to do this for the camera as well. It just kind of falls right over. But you all know that there's a simple way of fixing that problem. If I want this to stand up, I simply have to fold it a couple of times, like so, and like so, and like so. And now it stands up, right? For the audience at home, it is now capable of maintaining its form because I've introduced some structure. I've bent the paper in space, I've introduced some structure, and now we have basically a tube of paper, right? What this also does, interestingly, is it gives us a nice little table. We've now put some lines on this page, which should remind us of our standard approach to organizing and avoiding a blank page of problems, which of course this was originally. Before I introduced some structure, it was just a blank page upon which anything could happen. Now it is a table of columns in which 4 different kinds of things can happen, right? So I've introduced structure in that way. And that should remind us of the move we often make in these talks, which is we put just a line on the page. In the first talk I said, make this one day and the next, and then use that structure, the fact that you sleep and then there's a new day tomorrow, use that structure to organize your time, right? Remember that the day comes to an end and you relax, and then a new day begins, and you've got some things to do tomorrow. You're going to finish some things today and just get through it one day at a time, right? That's a nice thing to do. I'll definitely return to that image in one of the last talks, I think the second to last talk, called How to Finish a Research Project. That's really going to be a talk where we talk about that. But what we've been doing during going through the various sections of the talks, what we've been doing is we've been saying, let's label these parts here basis and purpose. And let's ask ourselves, for any section that we're going to be writing, for any part of our research project that we're going to be writing, let's ask ourselves, on what basis are we writing this, right? What gives us the source of our knowledge? What is the source of our knowledge? What gives us the authority, in a certain sense, to write this section? And what are we trying to do? Right? What are we trying to accomplish by writing that section? And if we have different answers to those questions, then we have a good sense of what the different parts are doing, what the differences between the parts are. And many of the questions I get as a writing consultant is, what's the difference between the background section and the literature review, right? Or what's the difference between the discussion and the theory, right? That sort of thing. What's the difference between the background and the analysis? And we can make that very explicit by going through these 2 questions, I guess, on what basis and for what purpose. For the Danish students in the audience, the har du hætti og hvad du ude på, right? If you can answer those 2 questions in plain and direct terms, you have something to work with. Now, I'm of course going to give you some quite general answers to those questions. I'm going to just kind of conceptually map that out for you. I'm also going to presume a particular very classic research paper structure with some headings that follow these headings, of course. And your project may not necessarily involve exactly those headings or those parts, right? You may not call it an analysis. You may call it the results section or the findings or the empirical part or something like that, right? Or you may get very literal, not literal, but literary, right? And come up with clever, evocative, poetic titles for each of the sections, right? So there's no, I'm not saying this is what the sections have to be called, nor am I even saying that this is exactly how it has to be divided up. But what I am giving you is a model for how to think about structure in such a way that you can go along and develop your own outline, as it were. All right, I just got a message, so I'm going to turn that off. All right. And we know what our outline is going to be. It is going to include the sections introduction, background, theory, method, analysis, discussion, and conclusion. And like I say, if you want different structure, different headings, feel free to do so. There are even like some very creative sort of qualitative studies. Sometimes grounded researchers like to think this way. They take the theory and the analysis and they sort of weave them together so that the text is constantly theory and analysis, a little more theory, a little more analysis, a little more theory, a little more analysis. That doesn't change the fact that some of their paragraphs are going to be theoretical and some of them will be analytical, right? So they're still going to be moving back and forth between these two moments. They're just not going to put all the theoretical paragraphs in one section, right? So you're still asking and answering the same kinds of questions. So keep that in mind as we're going along here. Now that we've already filled out some of these columns, right? We've got, I had 4 here. And we've got an interesting question. There's going to be this 4th column here, right? We've got the headings. What is the section going to be called? Here we've got what is the basis going to be, and here we've got what's the purpose going to be. And there's something I think we should just get used to and kind of quantify, because I think this will make your work go better. How much do you have to know to write one of these things, right? How much knowledge do you have to have? And there's a simple answer to that question that we can do just doing a little bit of math. If you remember back to the first talk, I talked about paragraphs, right? As paragraphs being at least 6 sentences and at most 200 words. And they each say one thing and support, elaborate, or defend it. But that one thing that they say is one thing that you know. So a paragraph is a unit of knowledge presented in a research project, right? Which means you have to know as many things as you've got paragraphs, although I also qualify that a little bit, because if Hemingway is right, you should know 8 times more, because there should be about 7/8 of the paragraphs that you have written you should not submit, right? So that's a really, if you do that, if you write 8 times more paragraphs than you need and select the 1/8 best of them for the surface of your iceberg, right, then you're doing high quality. You get a good sense of what quality really means there. It's being selective, making a bunch of things, sorting out the ones that are not so good, and then presenting the good ones, right? But what that means is that if we take a paper, and I'm not going to make any assumptions about how long your research papers are, the ones you're worried about right now, but let's just take a standard social science paper of about 8,000 words. We divide that by 200, and then we get 40. So we're going to have 40 paragraphs in that paper. And the structure is going to structure the arrangement of those 40 paragraphs. And then the question is how we're going to distribute them. And I'm going to give you just a pretty quick distribution of them. It's certainly not going to be the one that I would recommend is the only way to do it. But you'll notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sections. That's not good. 40 divided by 7 is hard math. I don't like hard math. So we're going to make the analysis 3 times longer than the other sections. That's pretty common. It'll have more things to say. You've got a lot of material to present. But now we've got 9 sections, so that didn't make the math much easier. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the introduction and the conclusion are hard to distinguish from each other on this scheme that we're using, because the introduction is really just based on the same thing that the conclusion is based on, and you'll notice it here. It's based on everything else, right? They're both just stacked on top of the rest of the iceberg. The ideal writer of the introduction and conclusion is just the person who wrote the rest of the project, right? All you have to know to write an introduction and conclusion is what's in the project, right? You don't even really have to know what's under the surface of the project, right? You just have to know what every one of those paragraphs says, because then you can introduce it, right? So in that sense, we're kind of stuck as far as distinguishing them. And so then we can say, why don't we just make them 1 section? And now we're down to 8 sections. And that's also why we have a talk near the end called How to Write the Introduction and Conclusion, as though it's 1 section, right? As though it's it's sort of a section split in 2 and put at the beginning and at the end of your paper. 40 divided by 8 is easy math. So what we're going to do is say we have units of 5. Notice that we had this split into 3 sections. So we can say 5 for the background, 5 for the theory, 5 for the method, 15 for the analysis, 5 for the discussion, and then let's say 2 for the conclusion and 3 for the introduction. All right. So now we have a shape to this. We have some quantities on it. We have different sections. We also know that the background section is roughly as big as the theory section, which is roughly as big as the method section. The analysis section is 3 times longer. The introduction and conclusion taken together is the same size as all of these 4 main sections. And so what we're, yes, ma'am? That's a great question. So how would it change if we just don't have a background section? It could be that you only have 35 paragraphs, right? So you could just say, that's how we're going to fix that. But really, the problem could also be, what if we have a very complicated theory and very little background? And then we might just shift this to a 7 and this to a 3, right? We might also have very little method to describe. So this becomes 10, and this becomes 2, or something like that, right? So we'll shift them around a little bit. The whole idea here isn't that there's some right answer to exactly that question. What about this structure? How then would we distribute it? The idea is just to say, this is a finite problem, and you can appreciate its finitude, right? You can say, this isn't totally off, right? There isn't an infinite amount of freedom. There's just some decisions you have to make about roughly how big these sections are going to be. And if you count that in paragraphs rather than words or pages, you're counting it in the unit of composition. Remember that it should take you maybe 27 minutes to write a paragraph. So with a 3-minute break, that's 2 paragraphs an hour. So we now know that 40 paragraphs will take you 20 hours to write. And that's really nice to know, right? It's just nice to be have that feeling for your writing. Good. So let's just round out this whole question of opening and closing. Of introduction and conclusion. The introduction will open the discussion with the reader, and the conclusion will close it. And I'm not going to say too much more about that. But it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're planning out the structure of your papers, that the introduction, because it's about 3 paragraphs, let's say, it could be 6 paragraphs if the paper is twice as long, right? But it's still the first 3, 4, 5 minutes of your reader's attention. It takes about 1 minute to read a paragraph, right? So that 1 minute should be, the reader should get something particular out of that, and you should have a kind of kindness. You should cultivate sort of a kindness towards your reader that says, in this minute, I want you to understand this. I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to support it or defend it or elaborate it. I'm going to make some decisions about that, right? So when you're thinking about the purpose of the introduction, remember what you're doing is you're taking a reader, you're meeting them for the first time, and you're going to give them 3 or 4 or 5 minutes to get into, to open the conversation with the reader. Right? It's very useful, this whole idea that it's 1 minute per paragraph is a very useful way of just thinking about structure also as a structure in time, right? So that what you're really planning is what the reader is going to spend about 40, 45, 50 minutes doing, right? 1 minute at a time, 1 paragraph at a time. That's the sort of thing you're trying to do. All right, so like I said, I'm not going to say much more about the introduction and conclusion. I'll say a lot and very detailed about it in the talk devoted to that. Are there any questions so far? Yeah.
The instructed that my conclusion should include scope for explicitly saying where further research should be done. 2 paragraphs isn't a lot.
Yeah.
Does that 2 paragraphs include
Yeah, for the people at home, the question, very good question, is the conclusion. Normally, we would suggest it would say something about future avenues of research. Is 2 paragraphs enough to do that? I will describe an introduction, or sorry, a conclusion in which that is possible. But this might be a great reason. Another reason you might want to add another paragraph is if you've been told you need some new perspective, you need to introduce some new dimension to everything, right? But again, if you make those decisions, then you're just making a decision about writing more paragraphs, which is fine, right? So there's no problem in that. But I will show a way of doing it in 2 paragraphs. Yeah. I'm not going to show that tonight, though, so don't be disappointed. Okay, back to this metaphor just for a moment. Please notice how simple the introduction of structure was. Like it was just folding the paper a little bit. It's the same paper, it's the same material. The introduction of structure lets you do something completely different with it in a totally new dimension, right? And the same goes for your paragraphs. You've got 40 paragraphs. They're the material that you're working with, right? By introducing some structure, you're able to do things with those 40 paragraphs that you can't just do by just, arranging them any which way, right? If you put them just in any old order and have no structure, then they're not going to be able to do the things that they can do with a little bit of structure imposed. And that's a very, very nice thing to know about structures. It gives us this ability to build a little machine, right, that can accomplish something, right? And I'm going to try to show you how that sort of machine can work. We'll work through it roughly in the order presented. Not quite, roughly in the order presented. So let's start with the background section. The background section is the section that I would recommend lots of people write these sections because they're in a discipline that has a kind of general competence. Maybe they're doing finance or marketing or organization theory or something. So they have some theories that they share with their discipline that they've learned in their classes. But then, of course, they've developed a research question of their own. And in order to answer that question, they've chosen some sort of empirical focus, right? So you've probably all done this. Often that empirical focus is a particular company or a product. It could be a country or a relationship between 2 countries. It could be a region, an industry, a market. Sometimes it's a managerial practice like lean or something like that, right? So you choose something that's going on in the world, something that is there, factually there, and you're going to study it scientifically, right? You're going to do some research into that. But because your reader is only your reader by virtue of being part of your discipline, right? That's what how you know you've got a reader, is that you're part of this community, this discipline. And basically your reader, I keep saying, is probably like the most interesting and intelligent and knowledgeable student in your cohort. So it's a fellow student. That's a good way of thinking about this. You're pitching this to a fellow student. So you're going to think about them as somebody that's taken all the courses you've taken, understood everything you've understood from them, read all the required reading that you've read, but of course, maybe not necessarily looked at the company that you've looked at, right? Maybe they don't actually know anything about the object that you've gone out to study. And so the reader is going to need some information about that object of a background nature. So if it's a company, it's going to need to know, what does the company do? How many employees does it have? When was it founded? What market does it operate in? Who are its competitors? This kind of thing. And this might not be information that you are getting out of your data, because maybe you did semi-structured interviews to gather data to answer your particular research question, right? So there's one thing you're doing is studying, you're gathering information just about the background conditions. And another one is you're gathering data. Those are two different parts of your research process. And so what you're going to do here with this background part is you're going to say, I am going to provide information to my reader. And it's very useful to think about that information, because, I mean, obviously you could gather infinite amounts of information, so you need some kind of principle. So try to think of this as information the reader will need to understand what's going on in the analysis, right? It's very, very important that you decide that this information will come in handy later. The reader will be thankful to have had it when they get to the analysis. And possibly, and I'll get back to that near the end, possibly in the discussion as well, to make sense of a particular kind of discussion that you might write, right? But certainly, to understand what the people are saying in the interviews, you're going to need this background information about this company or this country or this region or this product, right? That's the idea. Now, because you are very engaged in this setting, in this situation that the company is in, or the organization or the product is involved in, there are a lot of things that you will know, and you will just think, well, this is just something one knows if one kind of goes around in this sort of organization, right? If one pays attention to this industry, you just kind of know these things. But you don't want to write this to the reader as though the reader just has to believe you, right? You want to make sure that your reader comes out of reading the background section as knowledgeable as you are, which is to say, you have to give them sources for the things you say. Even though you know they're true, for sure, you have to make sure the reader knows where to go to back those claims up, right? And that's why you are going to provide documentation. The sorts of documentation we normally suggest for the background section is annual reports of the companies you are studying, right? Newspaper coverage of those companies, big data sets like the OECD data sets that you can access through the library, CIA World Book stuff, the World Bank information, that kind of, the IMF, that kind of stuff. There's lots of organizations out there that are publishing reports of various kinds. These reports are publicly available. You can reference them in the ordinary way, and you can back up your claims about whether or not a company did well in a certain quarter, whether or not there was a pandemic, kind of thing. You can back all of that up with good, proper sourcing, right? Even nonfiction books, right, like journalistic books or history books even, right, can be used to provide background information. We normally say don't cite Wikipedia, right? It's a great place to get background information, but what you want to make sure is whatever you find in Wikipedia, you then go to the sources that Wikipedia has provided, and then you use those sources to back up your claims. Yes, ma'am?
What if you choose to write about companies that have such kind of exceptional skills?
Yeah.
So might have this documentation, then might not be
Yeah.
that. Is that not advisable?
Yeah, that's a great question. Is it advisable to use information that is not available to the public, but is available to you because you have some personal relationship to the company, maybe you're employed in the company or something like that? I would not recommend using internal documents that are not available to the public, except in such cases where the company, of course, doesn't mind at all and does make those documents available to anybody who asks, right? If you can reference them properly and give instructions for the reader how they can verify these facts, right, then you're providing documentation. I usually say it should be publicly available in some way. So that's an imperfect one if you have to go to that, right? In most cases, information like that will be also available in a public form, right? Maybe you'll be lucky and the very thing that you want to say has also been dug up by a journalist, so you can just cite the newspaper report, right? Something like that.
But if not,
If not, I would definitely not advise it. And I would ask myself, can I do without? Is this a fact the reader needs to know? Because what you're saying really is, you, dear reader, are going to have to trust me on this, right? And in the background section, that's not the position you want to put yourself in. Right? We'll talk about where you can put yourself in that position. Okay. Good. And so now we get into this whole way of using these distinctions, right? Because some people do think like there's some people who talk about a theoretical background, or they'll be doing a literature review precisely to get this kind of background information, this sort of thing. So it's going to be quite interesting to try to distinguish the background section from the theory section. And the theory section is first of all distinguished by being based on literature, not this publicly available documentation. An easy way of kind of feeling this difference is just to say it's the stuff that you access through the library's journal databases or the academic books, not the bookstore, but the academic books in the library. So they are sources that are available to staff and students of major research universities like the Copenhagen Business School. Right? That's one way to put it, right? Is what we have here is a set of sources that require some specialized access, even though once you have that, it's all free, right? But you do need some specialized access. It's the journal literature that you are going to be using to present your theory, but it's also the literature that you imagine that your reader is familiar with. And remember, that's the big difference between the theory section and the background section. The background section is information the reader needs and doesn't have, whereas the theory section is based on a literature that the reader is already familiar with, right? So always imagine your reader of the theory section as somebody that is familiar with the basis on which you're writing it, right? And that's important because the purpose of the theory section is to activate the reader's expectations of your object. You want to build some expectations of the object. Now, I've said a lot about this in the theory talk already, and you can go back to that one to get more. I'll give you an alternative to exactly this as well, just like I did there. But a good way of summarizing it is just that it's a system of expectations of the object. So what that does mean is that after reading your theory section, especially having been given this background information, so being in possession now of some background information about the company you've studied or the country you've studied or the problem you're getting into, and now knowing that we're going to use this theory, the reader should have some very clear expectations about what the analysis is going to look like, right? How is the analysis going to be set up? What are the categories that we're going to use to observe the reality, right? Because this is just the way journalists would write about it. These are just facts as though they're just there, right? This is what categories, what concepts are we going to be applying to this material to see very specific things like organizational culture, right? Or I'm trying to come up with an example that isn't organizational culture. There's lots. I'll probably come up with something in a bit. But so once you've said we're going to use this theory, what that means is we're going to look at certain things in the data, and what that means is the analysis is going to look a certain way, and the reader will expect it to look a certain way, because the reader is familiar with the literature that has done similar kinds of analyses of similar kinds of organizations, right? So the reader is now prepared. So that's kind of at the general level of expectation, sort of the expectations as to the form of the analysis. But there's also going to be expectations as to the content of the analysis. So the actual results. This is what we sometimes call null hypotheses, right? And Ezra Zuckerman would remind us that we want to construct a compelling null hypothesis, not one that is obviously false. So when we reject it, we say, oh, of course. We want to have a null hypothesis that with the background information plus the theory, we think it would be really reasonable and very likely for this to be the result of the analysis, right? But then, because we've thought a little more about it, we're going to generate some hypotheses that, if true, would reject the null, right? But notice that that's more specific. It's not just expectations of the form of the analysis. It's actually expectations about what the analysis will show, right? And that's sort of at the edge of the theory section, usually handing off to the hypotheses, which then hands off to the method section. If you're a Bayesian, you might just talk about your priors, right? So you might explicate your priors, but all I'm talking about here is some sort of expectations about how people would behave, or how prices would behave, or what would happen in situations like this, given that we've set our minds to analyzing the world in these terms, like using these concepts. So you'll see now that if you do this, you've got two sections that are doing different things on different bases, right? That's kind of nice to know. We're going to skip the methods for a bit because it's easier to make sense of what the method is going to do if we have the analysis in place, right? I said these are going to be, this is information that will help us understand the analysis. This is expectations to the analysis, like expectations of the analysis, if you will. And so now we have to ask ourselves, what is the analysis going to do? We know for sure what it's based on, right? The analysis is going to be based on the data. But if the theory section has set up expectations, what is the analysis going to do with those expectations? And I think many of you have already heard yeah? Yes, that is the right answer, that the analysis is going to challenge those expectations, right? The not totally wrong answer, but not quite right answer is that it should confirm those expectations, or it should satisfy those expectations, live up to those expectations, right? We want papers, and when we're doing research, we want there to be some interesting tension between the theory that you're using and the analysis that you're doing, the empirical material that you're doing, that you're working with, right? So we want to learn something from the analysis that we didn't already know just from reading the theory, right? And one way to put that is that you want to challenge the expectations. I sometimes, to be provocative, say that the analysis brings about the artful disappointment of the reader's expectations of the object. The artful disappointment, not the artless disappointment of their expectations of your intelligence, right? So definitely keep that in mind, but challenge is a really good word for this, right? That there is some interesting pushback. The material that you're studying pushes back on the concepts, the categories of observation that you've set up in the theory. All right, and then I said there's an alternative way if you don't like that, because what's really happening here is we've got a nice connection back. Let's actually point that out, right? Like we've got a nice connection back there. So what it's going to challenge is the expectations you've specifically set up in the theory. And now hopefully you're already thinking, great, well, if I'm thinking about structure of a paper this way, then I'm going to be goal-oriented, right? I know what I'm doing in my theory section because I also know what I'm going to do in the analysis. I'm going to write these two sections with each other in mind, right? There's no shame in being strategic, as my logic teacher used to say, right? If you know what the goal is, you go for it, right? You set it up. But there is another way of doing it that kind of has the same thing. If you don't like this somewhat aggressive relationship between your analysis and your theory, you can use the theory to set up the reader's curiosity, right? Which is kind of feels a little bit like expectations, except the thing we do with expectations is we challenge them or disappoint them. The thing we do with curiosity very definitely is we satisfy it, right? So then the purpose of the analysis will be to satisfy the curiosity that we use the theory section to shape. Right? So we got the reader curious about what's going to happen with this person in the analysis, what's going to happen to this team or this group or whatever, right? And what's going to happen to their dynamics, or what's going to happen to the knowledge that they have to transfer from one company to another company. All right, so we got the reader curious, and then knowing what we intentionally got the reader curious about in the analysis section, we're going to set about deliberately presenting the data that the reader needs to be satisfied, to have that curiosity satisfied, right? There's still a feeling of tension there, because I mean, it's a classic literary tension, right? Of tension and release between curiosity and its satisfaction, right? Make sense? This satisfaction will go back to the curiosity. Okay, so now we have some basis, I would say, for understanding the method. If you recall from your own lives, in which your expectations have hopefully, I mean, that's the wrong way of saying it, hopefully you've experienced disappointment in your life. Hopefully you've had your expectations challenged, right? You've been surprised, right? You've expected things, other things have happened. You've overcome adversity, you've suffered, right? You've had an interesting life so far. So you know what this is like. You also know what happens when we get disappointed, right? We expected something, we get disappointed, we try to forget that experience as quickly as possible, as quickly as we can. And we say it didn't happen. We try to forget it, we get rid of it. In science, we do something similar. In science, what we do is we say, I have a perfect theory, or a very beautiful theory anyway. You have a challenging analysis. There must be something wrong with your analysis, right? In particular, there must be something wrong with your data, right? And that's why we have a method section. We have a method section to build trust in the data. Yeah, I should probably put an arrow there. That's the direction that we want to put this. So what you've done in the method section is you've told the reader the things the reader needs about your data that will let them take it for given, right? That's what data means, the thing we can take for granted in the analysis. So that when you get to the analysis, every time you cite your data, the reader finds that easier to believe than the analytical conclusions you're presenting, right? In the analysis talk that I did, I tried to encourage you to distinguish between interpretation and observation, right? So the analysis is going to go through and present a bunch of interpretations, and your basis for those interpretations will be the observations that your data really consists of, right? So your data, so you'll be quoting from your interviews, or taking descriptions from your field notes, or citing the surveys you've conducted, or the data you've extracted from Bloomberg or whatever, right? But those are all observations, and because the reader has been told how you collected that data, the reader trusts you. And so every time you go to the data, the reader says, oh yeah, that's easier to believe. And oh yeah, I guess I can see how that would make the interpretation correct. And I guess I see now why I should be disappointed, right? And so I then take that disappointment upon myself and I learn, right? That's the rhetoric there. But on what basis do you build that trust? And there is, of course, a temptation here, right? How do you build trust in your data? Well, you could cite the methods handbooks, right? So you could say, I did semi-structured interviews, and semi-structured interviews are very nice. They're very good sources of knowledge because, and then you quote up and down the methods handbooks on how to do semi-structured interviews. Now, why doesn't that actually build trust in your data? Because all it shows is you can read a book, right? What the reader needs to trust your data is your story about what you did and why you did it that way, right? The reader needs to get to know you and your way of thinking about doing semi-structured interviews. And yes, you can cite the methods handbooks and the literature, the methodological literature, to give you authority, basically, right? But the important thing, the important basis on which you write, you win this trust, is your experience, right? It's actually a place in your research project where you get to talk from experience. You get to speak in your own voice about what you did and why you thought that was a clever thing to do, right? So really keep that in mind, that when you're writing, you're starting to get lost in the literature or bored of your data or something like that, and you just want to speak in your own voice, write some paragraphs from your methods section, because you can really just say what you did, what you were thinking while you were doing it, right? Why that seemed like a good idea. Yes, ma'am? Yeah. Well, for me, all of those things like sampling, coding, all the things that you might have separate headings for, maybe there isn't going to be a method section, because in your discipline, you don't call anything methods, you just call it sampling procedure or something like that, right? So it's not important to call it method. In some papers, though, this actually is will be interesting for some of you. And I think somebody said this to me. Hopefully I haven't forgotten you, but I think I have. I am in communication with somebody about philosophy of science, right? Because there's actually, this can be unpacked in 3 levels, I've come to realize. If we unpack this, right, there is method, and then there's methodology, and then there's philosophy of science. All right. A methodology is your reflections about why your method is good. All right, so method is what you did. Methodology is in a certain sense why you did it. Right. So, and some papers will want you to separate those 2 things. Some supervisors want you to separate your methodology from your methods or procedures. So you will have a section that's just about how you sampled, right? That's straight method or procedure. And then you'll have a methodology about how to do regression or something like that, right? Whereas philosophy of science is, why is this knowledge? Right? So that's an even higher level, right? Where you start talking about epistemology and ontology and the phenomenology of your objectivity and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's lots of things that go into the philosophy of science. And some of you may be asked to write that as well. And it wouldn't be a bad way of organizing your paper to say, I'm going to do background, then theory, then philosophy of science, methodology, method, and my analysis, right? That would be one way of doing it. Another way is if your philosophy of science somehow informs your theory choice, then you can put it before the theory. Right? But yeah, if I have forgotten the person that asked about philosophy of science, please send me a mail and remind me. I think I'm going to do another, like an extra bonus talk at some point within the next few weeks, and we'll see if I can make that intelligent. I should be able to do it because I am a trained philosopher of science. That's actually I have a background in philosophy of science, so I should be able to pull that off. Good. I hope that answers the question, sort of, right? It doesn't matter what you call it. It just matters that there are maybe 5 paragraphs in your project that win the reader's trust in your data, right? Where your project is to get the reader to trust your data. That's important. If you're over here doing not expectation and challenge, so you think maybe you don't need the reader's trust as much because you're not going to be as aggressive with them, you still have to think about your authority. This is sort of a literary kind of concept, the authority to tell a story. You have to think about your storytelling rights. And so what you do in your methods section is you really tell the reader, what is my relationship to this organization or this product? Like, why am I in a position to, like, why should my story be satisfying, right? That's an important thing to keep in mind, right? And you still need to describe that in some way. When we were talking about method, I said this might also be somewhere where you're going to talk about what these days is called positionality. So if you have some social relationship, if you stand in some political or social relationship to your object, you might need to make that explicit, and you might need to make your awareness of that problematic bias you might have because of that explicit, right? So that would also go into that. And it makes sense to put it in or near the methods section. A so-called positionality statement. And it's not something that every discipline requires. And it's something you should definitely talk to your supervisor about if you think it's relevant. We've got one section left. It's 5 minutes past the hour. We're doing good. It's all right. This one's fun. The discussion section. You'll notice we've already told us what it's about, but there's a sense in which this emptiness here is useful. Is we should leave it empty in a certain sense. We will then fill it in with our ability to think, with reason, but it's empty in precisely the sense that you're not going to introduce anything new in the discussion section. My standard metaphor for this is if you're doing a crime novel, like a murder mystery, and you want the butler to have done it, you have to tell the reader that the butler is actually in the building, right? You have to tell the butler has to be a character in the story, because if you just bring the butler in the final chapter and say the butler did it, then that's not satisfying to the reading experience, which is the same thing here. If the discussion is going to do its job, it can't say the reason that this is interesting, the so what, if you will, of this project, is something I haven't yet told you, right? The reader should be able to get to the discussion with enough information to write the discussion themselves. Right? You want to make sure the reader has everything the reader would need to write the discussion pretty much as you said as you did. Yep.
Presumably, our goal is to enlighten / impress the reader with our discussion, which doesn't think, my goodness, this person's a genius. I've never thought.
A good question. Should we impress the reader with our brilliance, and should the reader feel humbled? Should the reader feel humbled by that brilliance, right? Yeah.
You're not supposed to get to the end of the novel and go, well, of course I know in the next chapter they're going to do this. But presumably the person reading the book needs to be able to work it out if they had a month of close reading. But you're the one that surprises them.
Yes, kind of, although there are murder mysteries that are perfectly legitimate pieces of literature in which the whole fun of the novel is to figure it out yourself, so that when you get the truth, you go, aha, I knew it. And right, I mean, that is actually, and that's more I would say that's more the kind of reader that you want to imagine you're writing for. You're making explicit what the conclusions are, and you're going to let the reader say, yes, well, of course it had to be this way, right? The reader is going to feel very, very rational and feel like they're being treated by a very, very rational peer at this point. So that's what we mean when we say it's going to be based on reason. We're not introducing anything new, no new sources of literature, no new background information, documentation, certainly no new data points, right? That would be almost cheating. Like that would be almost like so you don't introduce new data points. What you do is you reason with the reader, you use your intelligence, you deduce logically the implications of your research. So you know you're writing the discussion when you're not introducing any new sources, when you're working explicitly with your faculty of reason, your capacity for thought, and you're drawing out the implications of everything that's gone before. That's how you know you're writing the discussion part. And of course, there are little exceptions to this, and your supervisors will certainly also help you. In certain cases, they'll say, no, you do have to introduce a new theory in the discussion section. And then there are ways of doing that. I normally say, try to at least allude to them up here, right? Try to give the reader some chance that this is what's going to come in and save us at the end of the day. Right? Now, there are two ways of doing the discussion, overarchingly two approaches, general approaches to writing your discussion. One of them starts very much with this idea that you set up your expectations of the reader and then you challenge them with the analysis. What the discussion now has to do is say, what now, right? Given that the theory has been challenged, where do we go from here, right? It's sort of a so what, like what's significant about this, right? What are the consequences of the fact that the analysis has disappointed our expectations of the object? And the classic scientific way of doing this is to say, well, the theory's got to be changed. Something's got to give here. Right? The analysis is right. The theory wasn't quite right. The theory missed this or was wrong about it or predicted it incorrectly or whatever. So the theory has to learn from this. I'll just point it back up this way, right? And so we're going to make, so our contribution is very literally a contribution to the literature, right? So the implications of this research is that a new concept, maybe, a new set of parameters for the application of this theory, in the extreme revolutionary case, we can call it, like in the Kuhnian sense of scientific revolutions, the consequences of this anomaly that I've discovered is that we have to just reject this theory altogether and have a new one. Right? The theory is proven to be wrong because of my analysis, right? Radical, that's a radical solution. I'm not sure I recommend it for most of you. But if that's what you found, then that's what you found, right? And you can talk about those implications. Usually it's just a modification or a tweaking of the scope of application for the theory. You'll modify the standard model of something in a way, or you'll add a little bit of knowledge to it. Those are the implications. In the future, studying companies in these situations, we should not expect what we used to expect, which is what we described in the theory section. We should expect these other things, and now we can go into the next study better informed, right? Standard classic social science discussion of your analysis, of your results. But that's not the only way to do it. And I always like to take a jab at the economists here. I don't know if there's any economists in the room, but economists have these beautiful theories about like how prices are formed on markets, like price formation on markets. They're based on the law of supply and demand, mainly. There's lots of other things, but that's basically what they're based on. And of course, they're perfect, these laws. These laws couldn't be otherwise. They're pristine and logical. And then they do an analysis of the Danish housing market and the price changes on the Danish housing market. And they discovered that the prices are not behaving as the theory predicts they would. In fact, they would say it a little bit differently. We'll get back to that. So do they reject their theory? Do they even modify their theory? Do they change their model at all? Nope. They say there's something wrong with the market. Right? The market is inefficient. Right? It is being interfered with unwise regulation. Right? And if we remove that regulation, the markets would behave better. They would become more efficient. Right? That's a caricature of economic thought, right? But it's not completely off the mark, right? And of course, there's not just economists that think this way. If you have a theory of charismatic leadership and you study a company that lacks it, you're not going to say there's something wrong with our theory of charismatic leadership. You are going to say there's something wrong with a company that lacks it, right? And the solution would be to impose some charisma on the leadership in this organization, right? So it can be very managerial, like it can be a little tweaks to a management, to an organizational culture. It can be more political, like changes in the tax code or changes in some other legal framework. And just like we can have scientific revolutions, your analysis could demonstrate that capitalism is broken and we have to overturn it and replace it with something else, right? So we could have a revolutionary set of implications based on our analysis, right? But you'll notice that if we're going to have those practical implications, and the first implications were theoretical, these are practical, you'll notice that they will have to push back on whatever you said in the background section. So if you are going to suggest changing a law or replacing a manager, right, or introducing a layer of management or removing a layer of management in an organization, then it'd be a good idea to make sure that in your background description of the organization, whatever factor you want to change in your discussion is there. Right? So this is going to actually be a suggestion for changes to the background that you established earlier on in the project. Yes, ma'am.
How do you challenge that? How do you say you say that the behavior has to change, or is the theory not right?
Yeah, so it sounds like, let's just take a straight case where it'd be like if your research project was in ethics of some kind, like some sort of business ethics or the politics of organizations, something like that, where you are directly going to be studying and evaluating the behavior of human beings, right? And you're going to be studying it in sort of good, bad terms, right? Not just effective, not effective, but good and bad, right? Then I would say it sounds like the standard way to do this would be you make explicit an ethical theory. So a theory of the good life or right behavior or something like that. And then in your analysis, you show that people sometimes behave badly, right? And then you say the implications are that we maybe have to change the organizational structure in such a way that checks the natural tendency of people to behave badly. But that sounds to me like practical implications. And of course, that makes sense philosophically because all of ethics is part of so-called practical philosophy, not theoretical philosophy, right? So that really does would make a lot of sense. Like I would pitch that as a set of practical solutions. Now, there is actually, of course, the option to do differently, which would be that you make explicit the dysfunctional institutional norms that currently guide practice, right? Here you then confirm that practice is actually guided by them, right? But those outcomes are bad, right? People are treated badly under these institutional norms. But because our theory is actually an explanation of the status quo, then our implications are going to be we have to change the theory. Right? It's a rejection of the ethical theory that governs life right now. So that would be another way of thinking about it, right? And there certainly are lots of, in critical management studies, there are lots of ways that kind of approximate that, I would say, right? That the theory you explicate is actually the one that you're going to be deconstructing, right? So the analysis was going to take it apart. Yes, ma'am.
Thinking about writing a paper about democracy and the way that democracy fosters economic development.
Mm-hmm.
So then I have economic arguments that theory with China. So then I think so is that a kind of problem for me actually to explain why democracy can drive economic development without rejecting it?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well, I don't think I can solve your problem, but it's a really great example, right? So if I have a theory that says democracy is good for economic development, right? And then I look at the history of the world and I happen to cast a glance at China and then go, wait a minute, okay? Either that's democracy, right? Or that's not economic development. And neither of those two things maybe fit my concept of democracy or fit my concept of economic development. There was one possible solution. You could say, this isn't really what we mean by economic development, right? But you could also say this whole theory that democracy is good for the economy is maybe something we have to think different. Maybe that's not why we need democracy. Maybe the arguments for democracy have less to do with their economic effects and more to do with the fact that freedom is a good thing, maybe, right? I'm trying not to sound like I have opinions about this, right? But you know what I mean? Like, sometimes you will get into the situation where you have a theory that sounds really good, you really like it. Your analysis shows that it's perfectly possible to have economic development and without democracy. And then your implications are, this theory we have some work to do. Right? And maybe your discussion is just going to be, we have to explore whether or not we've understood economic development correctly, or whether or not we've understood democracy correctly. Maybe there's a glimmer of hope here, right? Maybe the economic development of the country that you think is a counterexample is actually explained by a little bit of extra like maybe there was growth of democracy in China at the same time, right? And so your theory is saved because you can correlate introduction of democratic processes in various corners with the economic growth. It's possible, right? I'm just spitballing here.
Like introducing quality in labor.
Yeah.
So this was by actually moving up the bottom of the society by making them more quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's not which kind of
It sounds like the kind of thing that you would put in the discussion. Thankfully, it's way above my pay grade, so I can't help you any further on that. Good. Oh, yes. I did kind of promise we would go over a little bit. So this is basically it. This is the suggestion that I have for you. Now, please, just to get back to the beginning, please remember, I didn't just outline your paper for you, right? You don't have to do it this way, and this may not even be the right way to do it. What I did show you is it takes about 45 minutes, right, to think through your entire project and give every section a name, give it some sort of measurable, quantifiable value where you can tell which are the big parts, which are the small parts, right? You organize your sources, and you can be much more specific than this because you can list the actual kinds of documents you're going to be using, the actual literature you're going to be citing, the actual methods you're using, the experiences you've had, and you can describe the actual data you'll be using here, so you can be much more specific. And even here, you can be more specific. What is the exact information you want to provide? What are the expectations you want to make? What is it that makes your data so trustworthy, right? What's the nature of the challenge or disappointment, and so forth, right? So you can be much more specific than I have been, right? But it can take that, it can take an afternoon, of course, and especially if you're doing this in groups, it's a great little exercise to do. Let's draw this picture of our project, and let's get all these different parts differentiated in such a way that we have a practical problem we can go at every time we go and write about it, right? Good. I think that worked. And I like the paper thing. Do you like the paper thing? Good. All right. I will turn off the camera and we will take a 5-minute break, and then I'll take questions.